You might be thinking, of course she's laughing. She's Lizzie. That is her coping mechanism. But I promise there's more to it than that, so let's take a look up close. Hi everybody! Welcome to my channel and thank you so much for having me on your screen. My name is Rosie, I'm a writer, editor, and crocheter, and on this channel we work on crafts and talk about the craft of writing. So far, because I am very new here, that has looked like this series, where I am making a sweater and close reading Jane Austen's novel Persuasion, chapter by chapter. And if you have been following that series, first of all, thank you so much for watching it. I promise I am going to continue. I need to make a couple of improvements on my end so that the process behind the scenes goes a lot more smoothly, and hopefully so that that will come out with better videos. But this week I wanted to do something a little bit different because I just came across what I have been thinking of as BookTok DramaTube, and wow, I have so many thoughts. I also have a different project other than the sweater that I really need to finish. I have right now about 8 of these little hexagons that need borders. So while we're talking, I'm gonna work on those and we'll kind of see how far we get. So to give you a sense of how this video is gonna go, I'm going to go over the broad strokes of this, ongoing controversy or conversation and talk about the patterns that I see going on. And I'm also gonna tell you about how I see those same patterns playing out in specific scenes in classic novels. We're going to have 3 examples. We're going to look at The Great Gatsby, The Age of Innocence, and Pride and Prejudice. So I'm really excited to get into that, but there are a few things that I just want to make clear up front. First of all, this is not going to be me hating on BookTok. I'm not on TikTok, and that wouldn't be fair. This is also not going to be me hating on BookTube or on YouTube creators who talk about BookTok. I watched quite a few videos to prepare for making this one. They were really thoughtful, they were really well researched. The creators made some amazing points, and I really encourage you to check them out in the videos that I'll link below. They've all been part of this community much longer than I have, of course, and this conversation has been going on for quite a while. But if you're like me and you just haven't made it to this particular corner of the internet, there's a chance that you're not familiar, so here's what we need to know. I got introduced to this issue by a video from Bookborn, which breaks down some of the main critiques book reviewers on TikTok tend to get, both on that platform and on this one and, elsewhere on the internet. These critiques include placing too much priority on aesthetics over content. Well, they're making content, but aesthetics over the substance or the contents of the books that they're reading. There are concerns about overconsumption, buying way too many books for the average person to afford, or way more books than someone could reasonably read within a month, and also generally just concerns about shallow reading, shallow engagement with the text. For example, there was a TikToker who got a lot of backlash because she said that the book had too many words, which was kind of crazy. If I could boil all of this down to like one core piece of criticism, I think it's primarily a critique about performative reading, concern about how some BookTokers might be focusing more on the outward appearance of being a reader than on actually experiencing and learning from and, reading the books. And intertwined with all of that is a sort of tendency to set what's trending on TikTok in opposition to classic fiction or literary fiction. According to Alina, has a great video about how that opposition is, false in many ways. And on the other hand, Rachel Oates has a great video about how some of the dynamics and behaviors that have emerged on TikTok may actually be pretty concerning. So it's a very complex and nuanced conversation. And at the same time, I know a lot of people are tired of it. It's one of those situations that I think often happens where this thing is happening and it's so complicated that a lot of what you hear is covering the same oversimplified bits of it. And so then when you actually get to the nuance, you don't even want to hear it because you're sick of hearing it. Anyway. That's the whole thing. What was I saying? It's a really complicated conversation. But what really stands out to me when you hear people saying, everyone's reading performatively and no one reads the classics anymore, some of those same concerns about performative reading actually appear in certain classics. And so this is what leads me to say that Lizzie Bennet would probably be laughing at BookTok performativity discourse. Now, you might be thinking, of course she's laughing. She's Lizzie. That is her coping mechanism. But I promise there's more to it than that, so let's take a look up close. So the first example that I want to talk about is from The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, published in 1925. Even if you haven't read The Great Gatsby, you probably know the basics. It's set in the Roaring '20s, and it contains some pretty heavy social critique about, shallowness, focus on appearances, performative dishonesty, not only on the part of Gatsby, the title character, but also, and probably more so, on the part of his love interest, Daisy, and Nick Carraway, the narrator. And when I hear about over-aestheticized bookshelves and giant halls of books, I immediately think of this scene. So Nick is at one of Gatsby's parties. He runs into his friend Jordan. They're wandering around the giant mansion looking for their host. Then this happens. On a chance, we tried an important-looking door and walked into a high Gothic library, paneled with carved English oak, and probably transported complete from some ruin overseas. A stout, middle-aged man, with enormous owl-eyed spectacles, was sitting somewhat drunk on the edge of a great table, staring with unsteady concentration at the shelves of books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. "What do you think?" he demanded impetuously. "About what?" He waved his hand toward the bookshelves. "About that! As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain. I ascertained. They're real." "The books?" He nodded. "Absolutely real, have pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice, durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages and... Here, let me show you." Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with Volume 1 of the Stoddard Lectures. "See," he cried triumphantly, "it's a bona fide piece of printed matter. It fooled me. This fellow's a regular Belasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness! What realism! Knew when to stop, too. Didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect?" He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. That last detail about how the pages haven't been cut is a reference to how books were produced at the time. When you bought them, the pages would have been folded so that you had to cut them apart in order to actually read the book. And so this guy is impressed not only that Gatsby has real books, but also that he's not pretending to have read the books. And it's a really interesting scene because of the way that performative reading is being taken for granted. For the owl-eyed man, it's almost a given that the books are just there to be impressive. And that's also something actually that shows up in the way that Nick introduces the library, where it looks like a fantasy library or a platonic ideal of a library that's been picked up from somewhere else and just dropped here. Even as they're standing in it, it doesn't necessarily feel real, and it's also not necessarily supposed to be real. I think this says a lot about how readers at this time might have understood, the status associated with books. Fitzgerald's audience would have recognized and, kind of been quietly chuckling at the idea that a lot of rich people out there probably have libraries just to look important. And going back to, the pages not being cut, there's an argument, at least from the perspective of this, random party guest, that if you're going to be performative, you might as well be upfront about it. Being kind of unapologetic about the fact that you haven't read your books is almost just as worthy of respect as having actually read them. So that's how F. Scott Fitzgerald might react to crazy book hauls. To get a little more perspective, let's go a little bit further back. And this time, let's think about the volume over depth critiques, the concern that BookTokers are just reading books for the numbers and not actually taking them in. And this issue is actually something that appears in The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. Now, this was published in 1920, but it's set in the 1870s. The protagonist of The Age of Innocence is Newland Archer, this young man who's done all the appropriate things to succeed and be educated in his social circle. And I've got to tell you guys, I hadn't read this novel in quite a while, but pretentiously name-dropping books is such a big part of Newland's character that I was sure that I was going to find something if I, did a quick search. And sure enough, here's one passage that I want to look closely at, and this one's covering not only Newland's knowledge of books, but also his knowledge of art. Newland Archer prided himself on his knowledge of Italian art. His boyhood had been saturated with Ruskin, and he had read all the latest books: John Addington Symonds, Vernon Lee's Euphorion, the essays of P.G. Hamerton, and a wonderful new volume called The Renaissance by Walter Pater. He talked easily of Botticelli and spoke of Fra Angelico with a faint condescension. But these pictures bewildered him, for they were like nothing that he was accustomed to look at, and therefore able to see when he traveled in Italy. I should have given you the context of this. Basically, Newland has gone to visit his fiance's fascinating unconventional cousin. And this is him at her house waiting for her to come and receive him. The piece of this passage that I really want to focus on is that bit where the pictures are like nothing that he was accustomed to look at and therefore able to see. Newland has read so much art history and art criticism. He's really, invested this time that you would think would make him not only very well read, but also very able to apply the principles that he's been learning. But rather than the books he's read expanding his mind and expanding his consciousness, all that reading seems simply to have trained him to just regurgitate the opinions that will make him sound the most intellectual. And when it comes to understanding and evaluating things that are actually unfamiliar, that might actually broaden his consciousness, he's not able to understand them at all. Newland really wants to appear well-read, but he hasn't necessarily learned much from his reading. And if he had a Goodreads account, he would be super annoying about it. But speaking of appearances, let's go back even further, and let's look at the reading aesthetic in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, published in 1813. There are two passages that I want to read here. And when the first one begins, Elizabeth Bennet is hanging out at Netherfield with the super rich Mr. Darcy, the more recently rich Mr. Bingley, and Mr. Bingley's pretentious, annoying sisters. Everybody starts to play cards, but Elizabeth knows this is not a group where she can afford to play for money, so instead she picks up a book, and this becomes a point of conflict between her and Caroline Bingley. Miss Eliza Bennet, said Miss Bingley, despises cards. She is a great reader and has no pleasure in anything else. I deserve neither such praise nor such censure, cried Elizabeth. I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things. In nursing your sister, I am sure you have pleasure, said Bingley, and I hope it will soon be increased by seeing her quite well. Elizabeth thanked him from her heart, and then walked towards a table, where a few books were lying. He immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded. And I wish my collection were larger, for your benefit and my own credit. But I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever look into. Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. I am astonished, said Miss Bingley, that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy. It ought to be good, he replied. It has been the work of many generations. And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. Neglect? I am sure you neglect nothing that can add to the beauties of that noble place. Charles, when you build your house, I wish it may be half as delightful as Pemberley. So there's a lot of interpersonal stuff happening in this passage, and I think when it appears in adaptations and, even when you're reading it, the first thing that pops out is, Miss Bingley being jealous of Elizabeth and kind of wanting to put her down in front of Mr. Darcy. That in this back and forth, the characters are treating books as a symbol of status. Both intellectual status, where Elizabeth is acknowledging being a great reader as a form of praise, and Mr. Bingley is wishing that he had more books because that would be to his credit. And also social status, where having a huge library that's been built over generations is kind of shorthand for having land that's been owned for generations, wealth that's been built for generations, the ability to buy books and cultivate intellectualism, tend to a family library, is a way for Darcy to kind of flex his wealth and power. One important piece of context here is that socially, the Bingleys are upwardly mobile. Their father made a ton of money in trade, and though their family hasn't owned land in the past, like Mr. Darcy's or even Elizabeth's family has, they are at a point where they're looking to buy land and kind of move up in the world, become members of the landed gentry class. Dr. Octavia Cox has a really good explainer on this, and I'll link that in the description below. But for this particular passage, I just want to close by pointing out that having a fancy library to perform wealth and status is the same thing that Gatsby is doing in the first example that we talked about. So again, performative aesthetic bookshelves are on the minds of authors and readers going all the way back to 1813. But going back to the story, this little status contest over reading between Miss Bingley and Elizabeth doesn't end there. It leads to a discussion about what is true accomplishment in a woman. Mr. Darcy implies basically that he likes ladies who read, and Elizabeth just, kind of declines to pick up on that. But, Miss Bingley does. And after making some digs at the women in Elizabeth's social circle, the next evening everybody is together, she decides to perform a reading aesthetic. So here's the second passage. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. She could not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered her question and read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his, she gave a great yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way! I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library." No one made any reply. She then yawned again, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes round the room in quest of some amusement. So Jane Austen here is really making fun of Miss Bingley for performing an enjoyment of reading that she doesn't actually have. And because she happens to be doing it specifically to impress Mr. Darcy, I think it's worth pointing out that the main problem with Miss Bingley's performative reading is not that she's performing intellectualism in order to attract men. Because in this time period and in her social class and in the way that, being an accomplished young lady would have worked, performing intellectualism to attract men is actually kind of her job. It is more of a problem that she's performing accomplishments that she doesn't actually have and that she doesn't necessarily need to have in order to tear other women down. But in my opinion, the biggest thing that Austen is critiquing her for is simply that she's being fake. This passage, especially with, the yawning and nobody answering, is a sharp critique of Miss Bingley, but it's also really funny. And by trying to act out enjoyment of this thing that she doesn't actually enjoy, Miss Bingley isn't really hurting anyone but herself. This sort of performative reading is the perfect kind of foible to amuse Elizabeth Bennet, who acknowledges later on in this chapter that follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, and I laugh at them whenever I can. Now, something that I don't want to leave out, especially as we're talking about, Miss Bingley trying to impress Mr. Darcy, is the fact that a lot of these BookTok critiques are very gendered. A lot of the reviewers who get criticized are young women. A lot of the books that they get criticized for liking are marketed to young women. And given that, a lot of young women are enjoying something in public is often all it takes to trigger a wave of misogynist backlash, it's important to be really careful about overstating, the social harm of performative reading on social media. This is something that people of any gender and any age can do. We saw that with, Gatsby and Newland Archer in our examples today. And my personal inclination, just, generally speaking, if I see someone in the world being pretentious about books, is kind of like the example with Miss Bingley, where, they're not really hurting anybody but themselves. At the same time, I recognize that pretensions about books on the side of intellectualism have done a lot to gatekeep power and prop up social structures that are not accessible to everyone and, are empowering to very few people. I also want to recognize, and this is a mess, I'm sorry. I also want to recognize, and this is going way beyond TikTok, pretensions about books that come with a failure to engage in critical thinking can lead to the spread of really harmful misinformation, or to a society that is more susceptible to that misinformation spreading. So let's say that performative readers are hurting more than themselves. The most worrying critique of BookTok, in my personal opinion, is that it does have a wider impact. It could be modeling a way of engaging with literature that is both unattainable in terms of volume of books that a person could read or own, and simultaneously setting the bar way too low in terms of how much of a text and its meaning you might actually take in. And I'm trying to be careful here. I'm really trying not to get too far into the weeds of applying my own critiques to TikTok, because again, I haven't spent time in that community. In spite of BookTok being the catalyst for this video, most of what I'm saying is meant to apply more generally to the act of performative reading, which is something that evidently has been an issue on authors' minds for at least the last 200 years. Anxiety over how people's reading may be performative, anxiety over how our own reading practices might fall short, has not only been part of literature and the literary world for, like I said, a very long time, it's also almost an inevitable side effect of being humans who care about reading and who do that together. So absolutely, we should be thoughtful. We should think deeply about what we read and what we watch and also what we think and feel about what we read and what we watch. In some ways, the whole performativity discourse within and around BookTok is actually really encouraging. It is continuing a tradition and a practice of engaging critically with the world around us, whatever that might look like for you. Now, if you enjoy engaging critically with classic literature, you might also like my other videos. So I would love it so much if you would check those out, or maybe even subscribe. Either way, I appreciate you so much for watching this video, especially if you have made it this far. In all this time, and including the computer loading and me messing up a bunch of times, I have made it through like 5 different hexagons. So we know it has been a while. Anyway, thank you so much again. And until next time, happy reading, happy crafting, and enjoy your day. Let's make it a good one.